Comrades, I cannot tell you how honored I feel to be invited to this seminar to celebrate the birth centenary of Puchalapalli Sundarayya, one of the great sons of India, one of the great fighters for socialism, one of the great writers about the past of Indian peoples and the future not only of the Indian peoples but also of the rest of the world, as we are informed by Comrade Arun earlier. One feeling I have again, I had spoken here earlier, is that Comrade Sundarayya should have been with us today. The kind of struggles that he led all his life is the kind of struggles that the people of India and the people of the, particularly of the so-called developing world or the third world, are engaged in. And this fight is going to go on for some time in future also. One of the major premises of the kind of perspective that Comrade Sundarayya derived from not only some of the great writers of the Indian tradition, but also from the writers of the Marxist tradition, is that the future of mankind is something that has to be assured by fighting the forces of exploitation over the long run. And there is no quick victory in that. Any idea that there can be a quick victory, if something of a quick fix solution, can lead into blind alleys. Now, I won't speak about those areas because these are matters of party strategy, these are matters of political organizations. I have been a teacher all my life, a teacher who have simply tried to be an honest teacher, no more than that. I began teaching on 1st April 1958 and I am still going on teaching. Now, one of the important things to remember is that India has been caught in the web of capitalism that arose first in the small city-states of Italy, the states which are very often celebrated, and rightly, as the origin of the European Renaissance, as the origin of many of the ideas which then percolated to the whole world. And then it spread to bigger countries, England, Netherlands, not such a big country, but bigger than the city-states, and France. And India has been caught in this web of inter-capitalist competition from way back in the 16th century. And if we want to trace the history of imperialism in India, imperialism was used by Lenin to designate a particular moment in history when all the great capitalist powers came into conflict with one another during the First World War. But the impact of colonialism precedes that moment of imperialism, precedes by several centuries. The first impact came in the 17th century itself, when Britain ousted Portugal from the Indian Ocean, Britain, France, and monopolized, these European companies monopolized Indian trade with Europe and the rest of the world, barring Asia. From then on, it has been a history of exploitation of the Indian people by the big capitalist powers in one form or another. I have divided the formal phase of colonialism into 4 subphases. The first phase began with it had begun already a little in Surat, a little in Bombay, because the city of Bombay was gifted by Portugal to Charles II. But in a big way, it really began with the victory of the British at the infamous Battle of Plassey, when the traitorous generals of Siraj-Dowlah refused to fight. Now, that first phase, and all through this is one of the things that is often forgotten, that the question of the land was central to colonialism from the very beginning. Land, what grows over it, what lies under it, the minerals, the water, on which fights are going on all over the world right now. This was the central issue. Sometimes it has been argued, even by people who have claimed to be Marxists, like David Harvey, that territoriality has not been the matter of capitalism. That's utter nonsense. Capitalism has always fought for territories and their resources, directly or indirectly. And from Bengal was the most, Bengal meaning at that time Bengal and Bihar. From the early 19th century, it also was joined by Orissa. This was the biggest source of land revenue. This was the most prosperous region in terms of not only agricultural production but also artisanal production. The source of the textiles that the British took moved down from Surat to Coromandel coast and then into the Gangetic Valley, Bihar, what is today's Bangladesh, much of today's West Bengal. And that land revenue was a straight tribute. What the British called investment was simply taking that tribute in the form of goods without paying anything to the Indian public, and that not only financed the further wars of the British in India, with that land revenue, with the tribute, they are able gradually to conquer the Marathas and conquer probably the most redoubtable enemy the British had faced in India, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan. And what is also forgotten is that that land revenue also partly financed, very largely financed in fact, much of Britain's war with France. That has been established by recent work done by both a Canadian Spanish economics historian, Cuenca Esteban, and our own economics historian, Utsa Patnaik. So, India played, rather the Indian public, when I talk about India, I do not talk about the Indian government, Indian rulers, puppet rulers or the existing rulers at that time, but the Indian people. The amount that they extracted during that period was huge. I had estimated that as 5 to 6% of the total produce of Bengal at the end of the 18th century, Bengal including Bihar. And mind you, the British Industrial Revolution was financed with only about 7% of the total income invested by them. So whatever would have been needed for perhaps financing an industrial revolution in the more manufacturing-wise developed parts of India, Fernand Braudel had characterized Gujarat as a possible source of capitalism in India at that time, could have been easily generated from the Indian resources. But I do not deal with counterfactual history. I am only refuting some of the stupid allegations of the neo-imperialist historians, and there are many of them among Indians also, among people in the third world, to show the dimensions of the exploitation of India. Exploitation also, we must not forget, of the slaves that the European powers transferred from Africa to the rest of the plantations and mines in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Islands. And then when that slavery was theoretically abolished, much of it really still remained on the ground. Indian workers were indentured from this region, from Telangana, from Bengal, from Chhattisgarh, and were sent to Mauritius, to Fiji, to the Jamaican plantations of the father of the great liberal politician of England, Gladstone. Now, the second phase began with the abolition by the British of the East India Company's monopoly of trade with India. That was in 1814. So 1814 to 1858 was the second phase of British colonialism. In that phase also, land revenue remained a primary source of tribute. Now, when I am talking about the extraction of land revenue, it is not simply a question of how much money was taken, but the processes with which that money was extracted. And those processes created enduring structures of unfreedom in this country, everywhere. What are those processes? Those processes were creating intermediaries. The British had a very thin administration on top. They were always money conscious. How much money they were spending on their administrators whom they had to pay well. And then at pittance, they had clerks. For example, I will give you one example. When a typical clerk in the Bank of Bengal was paid, the Bank of Bengal was founded in 1806, then was renamed in 1809. When a typical clerk got 6 rupees per month, the British secretary, along with house and other facilities, was getting 800 rupees per month. And that difference remained throughout the period of British rule, throughout the period until the Imperial Bank was nationalized by the Indian government. At the end, the clerks were getting somewhere around 100 to 130 rupees per month, and the British General Secretary was getting somewhere around 4,000 rupees per month. And those differences also went to other areas. Now, one of the points that I have emphasized, a point that comes straight from Marx, straight from the work of Lenin and Engels, but we forget that capitalism, once it has conquered the world, can use many modes of exploitation. There is one mode of production under capitalism pure, if you like, where the means of production are owned by a small group of people and the others are wage laborers, the proletariat. But capitalism, when it spreads across the world and even in its homeland, can use other modes of exploitation which pre-existed capitalism. In Scotland, for example, when England was first industrializing, they used serf labor for mines in Scotland, the mines that are owned by the lords. And I have listed all the modes of exploitation that capitalism is used. Let me try to read that list. Even I couldn't remember all the modes. I had to again and again try to recapitulate what had happened in different parts of the world. I'd say yes, particularly in the colonial countries, you have straight chattel slavery. Slavery can take many forms. Slavery that the Europeans used in the plantations was chattel slavery, where people were simply sold and bought like cattle, and were in fact very often cared for less than cattle, because cattle needed more sustenance, and they could always capture slaves from Africa by giving guns to some of the chiefs and then killing the resistors and taking them on to the ship. There was slavery in other parts of the world, particularly in North Africa, Arab countries, in our country, in South India also. But that slavery generally was not chattel slavery. You could not generally sell and buy people just like that. They had certain rights, they are attached to land or certain kinds of establishments. They are temporal slaves, for example, in South India. And this was different from the kind of chattel slavery that the Europeans used. There are probably some remnants of chattel slavery in some parts of Kerala also. We must not also forget that the history of India is also not simply a glorious history. It is also a history of exploitation of the ordinary people, of the women particularly in many cases, by the upper caste people. Now, then we have various kinds of control which are called feudal control. You can have demesne control, you can have manorial control. You can have a demesne which is worked by the serfs indirectly, serfs with some rights to the land they themselves cultivated for their subsistence. And you can have pure manorial feudalism, where the people working for the manor had no rights, and the feudal lords had also judicial rights over them. You could have combinations of this demesne type of control and the manorial type of control, and you can have side by side in some cases also free peasants in that area. Now in India also we had many of these types of exploitation before the British. One of the canards propagated by the British was that India did not know any private property, nor did China. And this is utter nonsense, as has been proved by the work in Rajasthan, by the work in fact, Uttar Pradesh, in the Vrindavan. There are gifts to the Vrindavan temples by the Mughal emperors. And these gifts were pure gifts. The land could be transferred. The major difference was that under capitalism, private property owners had unrestricted power over what they could with their land. In China or in India, the use of the land or the transferability of the land was restricted. You could have private property rights, but you could transfer that land only among certain groups. For example, Mirasdari land in many areas could be transferred only to Mirasdas. And in China also, this kind of restriction led to the creation of a powerful merchant community which did not become a capitalist class in that sense. Now, and you can then, of course, have straight wage labor with private property and land. And one thing that you must remember, and this is forgotten by many historians, that with all this talk about the British gradually introducing representation by the Indians and so on, India was an utter despotism. There was no authority that the Indians could appeal to if the Governor General or even the district magistrate did something, and the authorities refused to correct that. There was no court of appeal. There was no civil society in India in that sense. Very few Indians had real civil rights. And this is one of the things that is often forgotten. I'll refer you to only some of the works of earlier people. There was a civilian called John Beams, who was a linguist, who talked about how in a district, the indigo planters actually ruled that district. And the district magistrate really was subordinate to them, unless he could get some sanction from the higher authorities. And you also had, some of Rabindranath Tagore's stories are full of the ways. His great novel Gora, or his short stories, are full of the ways in which the law was violated again and again by the British. And the proper description of that has been given by, I think his name is Nasir Hussain, who analyzed the situation in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. It was the law of emergency. The law of emergency could be invoked by the British anytime, under any situation. And the idea that the British introduced law and order in this country is so ridiculous. Indians did not have any right of appeal against violations until the coming of Indian independence in 1947, with all this talk of representation of Indians. Now, the third phase of British colonialism is the phase which began from 1858 to 1914. I have called it the phase of free trade imperialism, in the sense that by this time the British had destroyed the artisanal industries in India, not just the British, but mainly the British imports into India, and they had come out on top as the biggest manufacturing nation and also the biggest financier. So they didn't need very often to directly exclude Indians from fields of enterprise as they had done earlier. All they needed was to have those positions of privilege. But the point is that phase of imperialism of free trade could be really properly implemented in colonies. Colonies like India, where they could not react by putting up protection against British goods or other imported manufactured goods. It could not be enforced against the United States, where they had protection against the British manufacturers almost from the very beginning. It could not be used in the so-called dominions under British control in Canada, Australia. They had huge protection against foreign manufacturers. They could also give state patronage to their own manufacturers, to their own produce. It could be enforced only against abject colonies like India, Kenya, or South Africa, not even South Africa, because there the Boers put up resistance. And it could be enforced against what John Robinson once called voluntary colonies, of Latin America. Latin America secured British help against Spain in the Spanish America and against Portugal in Brazil, on condition that they would free their trade fully. And this was quite acceptable to those countries because they came to be controlled mainly by landlords who claimed to have Spanish or Portuguese origin, Creole, so-called Criollos. Now, in India also, the great Lord Ripon, who was often celebrated as a very liberal, fine Governor General, it is under his dispensation that final free trade was enforced in India. And that free trade was, in Rajani Palm Dart's apt phrase, one-way free trade. Because in many cases, the Indian goods abroad faced protection. They faced protection earlier in Britain. British textile industry grew up by protecting itself against Indian manufacturers mainly. This has been very well brought out by Inikori. This had in fact been brought out by a major economic historian of India who has been forgotten, P.J. Thomas, who wrote that very fine book, Mercantilism and East India Trade. And then we come to even in this phase, when private British capital was more important in India than it had been before, because earlier on the East India Company only licensed private capital and it was a restricted field. Even in that phase, the primary source of the extraction was a tribute. And the major source of that tribute meaning something for which you did not have to pay. And the tribute paid as earlier, not only for the conquest of whatever little remained of the subcontinent, but also the defense of all the British possessions from Africa to China. Lord Salisbury, who was the Secretary of State for India, under whom Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India in the middle of the biggest famine that India was going through in 1876. He said, India is just an English barrack in the Oriental seas. And the Indian army was deployed everywhere, in Africa, in China after the so-called Boxer uprising, when all the wonderful civilized European nations sacked Beijing and destroyed some of the great palaces in Beijing. And Mark Twain had some wonderful things to write about this performance. Now, in that phase also, as I said, the tribute was the main source of extraction, not private profit. Whatever profit was extracted by the private capitalists was taken away to England. There was very little investment, and Keynes, who was after all not a fool, had recorded that way back in 1911. There was very little net private investment of capital in India. Now, then we come to the fourth phase, which is the phase from the decline of British colonialism in India, the interwar period, and my time is coming to an end, so I'm trying to see what I can say in the rest of the 8 minutes I have. Now, in this phase, already in India, the independence struggle was hotting up. The masses were involved in that struggle. And from the 1920s onward, a Communist Party of India was operating in this country. And the European nations were extremely scared of the communists, not just the British. This was the first real systemic challenge that capitalism faced. And they saw raids under every table, as the saying went. You had the Mirat conspiracy trial. There were a series of trials of that. But at the same time, peasant movements started up. Capitalism did not have, with all its murderous advance, all the easy way everywhere. They faced again and again challenges, but with better military technology, better organization, they overcame most of those challenges. And then after independence, you have, this is something that has to be very clearly recorded. There are two different events which led to the liberation of not only India but also the other countries. Apart from the domestic internal struggles, the British could not have held on to India at all. I mean, it was quite clear from the period 1940-43 that they would be unable to manage all the fights that would break out all over India. But there are two other events. The defeat of the old European imperialist powers by Japan really created space, new space for the liberation struggles that were going on in Indochina, Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Malaya, which failed, but it went on for long years under communist leadership. And of course, the rise of the Soviet Union as the second most powerful military power in the world. And that there are two different ways to look at, many different ways to look at such great events as either the rise of the Soviet Union or the fall of the Soviet Union. But one of the points that people of the third world must remember, and the working class of the world must remember, that it is because of that systemic challenge by the Soviet Union, by the rise of China, at first fortunately in alliance with the Soviet Union, with the help of the Soviet Union, that led to the peoples, particularly of many countries of Africa, to get political liberation, and for the working class of Europe to get a much better deal than they had had earlier on. It is the fear of communism which led to that. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, as you know, has led to a total disarray of the working class in Europe. Even with, there are struggles going on in every country, but those struggles still remain not united. They still remain fragmented. And the agenda before them has yet to be clearly set out by some of the people who are leading the struggle. Now, from the fall of the Soviet Union, we are facing an imperialism of free trade combined with footloose finance and unlimited military assault. The United States has emerged with such a huge military advantage over the rest of the world. They have a greater arsenal than all the other countries combined. And we also must remember that during this period, they have been able to get collaborators in every country, in every so-called developing country, including our own. No colonialism has finally come out victorious without collaborators joining them. Again, it's an untruth to say that colonialism was brought to India by the Indian merchants. That's a totally false statement. But on the other hand, in the 1857 revolt, the biggest Mahajani farm in Delhi, whose name I forget, continued to aid the Mughal emperor until the last day almost. So it is not that all merchants were aiding the conquerors. But it is true that once these landlords particularly saw that, it is better for them to have control over their serfs or serf-like tenants than to lose them in a fight which they are not sure of winning, they became collaborators of the colonial rulers. This happened again and again in every country. So landlordism and colonialism have gone together. There is a long history of that in southern Italy, an area which had originally led to the creation of small city-states. There is a code of Amalfi, which was taken as the code for the capitalist states for a long time. Karl Marx refers to the Amalfi Code in some of his writings. But then Amalfi and the rest of southern Italy was first conquered by the Norman conquerors, and then later on by the Spaniards, and finally again by the Bourbon rulers of the Spaniards. And southern Italy remained under landlord control and remained the backward area of Italy from the 12th, 13th century down to the end of the 19th century. It is that area that Gramsci was investigating in his southern question. So we must not think that landlordism is something that can be whisked away just like that. It can leave an extremely long destructive trail, and it can lead to the warping of the culture of a whole people. And in the current phase, landlordism, this crony capitalism, this completely unregulated capitalism that has been unleashed from 1991 in this country, they are all in alliance. I am sure Professor Prabhat Patnaik will tell us far more about this. So my time is up. So with many thanks again for inviting me to this great seminar, to all the comrades who are involved in this. I end my session. One request, I am rather hard of hearing. So the best thing is to put the questions in writing so that I can see them properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor అమయ్ కుమార్ బాక్షి. వారి ఇప్పుడే చెప్పినట్టు వారి వినికిడి సమస్య ఉంది, అందుకని వారికి ఉద్దేశించిన ప్రశ్నలని రాతపూర్వకంగా ఇవ్వండి, ఇంగ్లీష్లో రాసి ఇవ్వండి. ఎవరైనా తెలుగులో రాయదలుచుకుంటే రాసినా పర్లేదు, మేము వారికి ట్రాన్స్లేట్ చేసి ఇస్తాం. నౌ ఐ ఇన్వైట్ ప్రొఫెసర్ ప్రభాత్ పట్నాయక్ టు డెలివర్ హిస్ స్పీచ్. He is going to speak about patterns of class formation since independence.
Comrade Raghavallu, Professor Ramyo Bagchi, Professor Ijaz Ahmed, comrades and friends. It's an honor to be associated with any event that bears the name of Comrade P. Sundarayya. Not only was he an outstanding leader of the communist movement in this country, but in the entire galaxy of communist leaders anywhere in the world, it would be difficult to come across anyone who combined in the same measure dedication to the cause of the people, with the concern for comrades, with an extraordinarily Spartan lifestyle, and of course with a meticulous thoroughness which was legendary. Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad, who was brought to the movement by Comrade Sundarayya, in his autobiography, How I Became a Communist, has a chapter in which he discusses Comrade Sundarayya's extraordinarily Spartan lifestyle through a number of episodes of the time when they used to meet before he joined the communist movement. As a matter of fact, a political opponent of Comrade Sundarayya, a class opponent, Neelam Sanjeeva Reddy, who went on to become president of the country, once called Comrade PS the Marxist Mahatma, which in essence captures the kind of person that he was. This combination of Spartan lifestyle, together with extraordinary concern and care for comrades, is something of which my first direct experience was when I attended my first party congress that was in Vijayawada in 1981. There was a hall in which durries were spread out and all of us just slept one after another. And therefore the material conditions of life, you can imagine, of the delegates to the party congress were very Spartan. But there was a group of extraordinarily dedicated volunteers. We were told, personally instructed by Comrade PS, who looked after us with such great loving care. Many of them, I believe, are today in the leadership of the communist movement in Andhra Pradesh. But that was really an extraordinary experience that we all had. My first meeting, of course, was in a decade earlier, in 1971, when I was teaching in Cambridge, occupying a post which Professor Bagchi had just vacated. And my teacher in college, Matthew Kurian, wrote me a letter. When the communist split took place, you may recall that most of the intellectuals, outstanding, well-known communist intellectuals, went to the CPI. As a result, the CPIM was trying to build up a cadre of intellectuals, and Matthew Kurian was organizing a conference in Madras Christian College, Tambaram in 1971 to actually put together a number of intellectuals who can then actually work for the CPIM. I think many of today's leaders in the CPIM, like Prakash Karat and so on, were people who are associated with that conference. I think Comrade Raghavan would have been too young for that. And to that I had come, and Matthew told me that PS wants to talk to you. So I was naturally a bit scared. I was 25 years old, general secretaries of communist parties. PS was then the general secretary of CPIM. Did not talk to one easily. One didn't have easy access to them. I was a bit scared, so he came in. He told me, I liked your paper, it's very good, but I find that in some of your expressions there is a touch of Naxalite thinking. Now, the fact that not only, I had mentioned somewhere about the bourgeoisie being subordinated to imperialism, the fact that not only had he read the paper, but read it with such thoroughness that he even noticed these little expressions is something which really was the kind of meticulous person that Comrade PS was. Talking today, I really talk with a degree of fear that suppose he had been in the audience, then he may not have liked what I'm going to say. At least even if he would have liked, that fear remains in my mind. What I'm going to talk about today is really a contrast between the classical experience of capitalist development and the kind of capitalist development that we are witnessing in India today. Now, I think this contrast is something which is best summarized if we begin with a view of capitalism that normally most people have. And that view is that capitalism destroys pre-capitalist production systems. And of course, the workforce that is released by this destruction is then eventually absorbed in large measure into the active army of labor under capitalism, and to some extent remains as a part of the reserve army of labor under capitalism, and that this happens through the spontaneous working of the system. That capitalism, even as it destroys earlier modes of production, nonetheless at the same time absorbs those who had been so displaced, who were workers in the earlier modes of production, in a way where they now begin to form a proletariat under capitalism. Now, this view is very common. This view is something which, for instance, even in the famous debate on poverty after the Industrial Revolution between Max Hartwell and Eric Hobsbawm, while Hartwell was basically denying that there was any increase in poverty, even Eric Hobsbawm, who talked about an increase in poverty following early Industrial Revolution, nonetheless suggests, at least implicitly, that yes, but this began to reduce after those displaced by early industrial revolution began to get absorbed in the active army of labor. That capitalism eventually, after a period of transition, begins to absorb in large measure, leaving aside a certain reserve army, large measure those who had been displaced. This is there, for instance, even implicit even in Professor Amartya Sen's comment when he talked about London and Manchester not having been built without displacing some peasants. The suggestion, of course, is that if not those peasants exactly, but their descendants are ones who ultimately then begin to get absorbed into the productive system called capitalism, and therefore the travails they face because they are displaced are necessarily transitional. Now, I believe this is not a correct understanding. I believe the fact that those displaced by capitalism's destruction of the older modes of production, the older communities, the fact that they got absorbed in some sense, or the fact that they did not continue to remain unemployed forever, is something which was because of three very exceptional, among other things, three very exceptional circumstances which prevailed at that time. The first exceptional circumstance, which do not any longer obtain, was a massive migration from Europe to the temperate lands of white settlement, about which Professor Bagchi has written at great length. 50 million Europeans in the 19th century actually went over to the temperate regions of white settlement like Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, and that was a substantial outflow. How substantial it was is something which would become clear if we just take the case of one country, in Britain. Between 1815 and 1910, 16 million people migrated out of Britain, while Britain's population on the base date, that is in 1815, was only 12 million. In fact, almost half the increase of the population annually migrated out of Britain. If you want to put it in a comparative perspective, if you had emigration from India on the same scale, then between independence and today, 40 crore Indians should have migrated. Now, obviously, there is no place in the world to which they can migrate, and therefore, the idea that that specific circumstance can prevail in today's world is obviously far-fetched. The second factor which helped, in a sense, in preventing a substantial addition to the reserve army of labor was the fact that exporting unemployment was available to Britain, as Professor Bagchi was discussing, that basically British goods could be sold in the colonial and semi-colonial markets which were available to them on a tap. They could just open the tap and of course sell their goods here. The long Victorian and Edwardian boom, which John Hicks, the economist, called the great long boom of capitalism prior to the First World War, is something that simply would not have been possible if this colonial and semi-colonial markets were not available to Britain, which was then the leading capitalist country. As a matter of fact, even at the end of the century, as Hobsbawm shows, half of British exports consisted of textiles, and most of them were going either to India or to China. Now, obviously, therefore, that colonial and where they were displacing the traditional petty producers. So you have an export of unemployment, which of course at the same time props up the domestic system and gives rise to a certain degree of absorption of those producers who had been displaced. And the third factor is the fact that in much of the 19th century, machine making was an extraordinarily labor-intensive occupation. A lot of the machines were actually made by bare hands almost. As a result, what you had is that even though a lot of workers could get displaced through machine using, at the same time, making of those machines whose use would destroy workers is something that also absorbed a lot of the workers. I have a feeling that some of Marx's prognostications about the falling rate of profit and rising organic composition of capital might have been inspired by that experience, where you actually find that the labor embodied in machine making was extremely high, because machine making itself was not necessarily a particularly mechanized process. At any rate, these are the extenuating circumstances which were available to capitalism in its classical phase, and of course none of them is available to countries like India, which are late industrializers in that sense. Not only are these not available to countries like India, not only is it the case that they actually carry with them a legacy of vast unemployment and mass poverty, which is left behind by colonialism, as Professor Bakshi was arguing. But what is more, they are specifically handicapped under the neoliberal regime, or I should say handicapped, and they're specifically characterized under the neoliberal regime by three features which make absorption of labor extremely difficult. Now, the first feature, of course, is that you have, in this very period, the following scenario. Let's imagine that a country is saddled to start with substantial labor reserves. This has the effect of keeping real wages, even in the organized manufacturing sector, low. As productivity rises, surplus rises. As surplus rises, since the surplus earners tend to have a pattern of demand for commodities which is extremely capital intensive or less employment intensive, and with productivity, the employment intensity of this pattern of demand tends to keep going down, because much of it is influenced by the lifestyles prevailing in the West. You actually find that with the rise in the share of surplus, there is a substantial rise in labor productivity, and therefore a substantial, enfeebling of the capacity of the growth process to absorb labor. Therefore, you can, even with the rise in share of surplus, you can have, through higher investment ratios, even higher growth rates. But the capacity of these growth rates to absorb labor also correspondingly gets reduced, and therefore you can have a combination of no increases or no reductions in the relative size of labor reserves, if anything increases in the relative size of the labor reserves, coexisting with an increasing growth rate of the kind that we have been experiencing in India. This is further added to by a second phenomenon, and that consists in the fact that you have now a huge process of primitive accumulation of capital, in which you have a reduction in the flow incomes of peasants and petty producers. I should say that because the anti-colonial struggle had taken off in India in the 1930s because of the Great Depression that had squeezed the peasantry, the agenda of the anti-colonial struggle had entailed a degree of protection and promotion of peasant agriculture and petty production. Now, of course, this agenda was betrayed in large measure as land reforms did not happen, land redistribution did not happen in the post-independence period, but it was also respected in some measure, and then one of those being that the state under the dirigist Nehruvian regime, and I don't mean Nehruvian only in the sense of Nehru's period, but the overall period pre-liberalization, in the Nehruvian regime, the state did come to the aid of peasants and petty production, no doubt to the aid of relatively better off sections of the peasantry through subsidized credit, through subsidized inputs, and bank nationalization was a means of providing subsidized credit, through subsidized inputs, through assured prices for a variety of agricultural crops, through extension services, through research and development under the aegis of the government, which was made available gratis to the peasantry, through all these ways, and of course through protection in terms of quantitative restriction on imports and supplemented by extraordinarily high tariff protection, the state came to defend and protect in some measure peasant agriculture and petty production, whose beneficiaries, of course, were not all peasants, but nonetheless which actually had an important role. With neoliberalism, all that goes. And with all that going, you have once more agriculture and petty production generally becoming relatively less profitable. In certain circumstances, even simple reproduction becomes impossible, which is why you have such peasant suicides in large numbers. And of course, this adds to the flow of persons to the towns to swell the reserve army of labor. And therefore, the relative labor reserves, whose absorption becomes difficult, are in fact added to by the process of dispossession of the peasantry. A third factor also helps in the neoliberal period, because in the neoliberal period, since Keynesian demand management measures are more or less eschewed, really speaking, the source of growth tends to be the formation of bubbles. You have bubbles in asset prices, which then give rise to a burst of demand, because of which there is a burst of investment, and of course, then the bubble collapses and the burst of demand collapses, and so on. India has been a beneficiary not only of the asset price bubble in the United States, which of course boosted demand in the world economy as a whole through our exports of certain kinds of services at any rate, but what is more, also the formation of a domestic bubble. We had our own stock market bubble and so on. Now, with the collapse, even when these bubbles are operative, even when you have a situation where growth is quite high, emerging economic superpower so-called, nonetheless you find that the absorption of labor gets reduced, or the relative size of labor reserves increases. When the bubbles collapse, the increase in the relative size of the labor reserves is even greater. As a result, under neoliberal capitalism, there is a tendency for the relative size of the labor reserves, far from reducing, of actually going on increasing, even in periods of high growth, and of course, still faster in periods when you have a collapse of the growth rates. Now, this has a number of very important implications. The first implication, of course, is that Marx's perception that, okay, under capitalism, you have capitalism, despite, against its very wishes, bringing into being a substantial workforce, a substantial proletariat, which, as it were, forms a new community, and that leads on to a transcendence of capitalism with the introduction of theory from outside. That view is something which, in the current conjuncture, becomes more difficult to correspond to reality, or reality is far more difficult for reality to correspond to that view, because that process of formation of the proletariat is something which gets hindered by the fact that you have informal employment, intermittent employment, casual employment, all of which are really euphemisms for an increase in the size of the reserve army of labor. What is more, even the active army of labor is increasingly pushed into informality and casualization, so that far from there being a force that gets built up, that goes from strength to strength, you actually find that tendency being reversed, counteracted, repressed, turned back in the era of neoliberal capitalism, because of the fact that you find that labor reserves grow very rapidly relative to the active army of labor. Now, this has, of course, a number of economic implications. I need not go into them. For instance, if you look at India, the real wage rate of organized industrial workers between 1988, 89 and today is something, and 2010, has not increased. Notwithstanding substantial increases in labor productivity, you find that the real wage rate in absolute terms has, if anything, actually come down during this period, which, by the way, is a phenomenon you find in other countries as well, the feature of neoliberal capitalism. You also find a concerted attack on the rights of trade unions, quite apart from the spontaneous weakening of trade unions that comes about because of the fact that it's far more difficult to organize so-called informal workers, casual workers, and so on. There is an attack on the rights of trade unions, which of course the government has not yet succeeded in pushing through under the rubric of the so-called labor market flexibility, which is nothing else but really a class assault by the bourgeoisie, by the corporate financial interests on the organized working class. But one feature of it, which I really want to draw attention to, is that this gives rise to a substantial growth in what Marx had called the lumpen proletariat. Now, the lumpen proletariat, not that everybody who's informally or casually employed belongs to the lumpen proletariat, but I believe that the size of the lumpen proletariat is something which is directly related to the size of those who belong to the reserve army of labor. Marx's notion of lumpen proletariat does not only refer to the destitute and the poor. In fact, he called Louis Bonaparte a princely lumpen proletariat. And he also talked about bourgeoisie, elements of the bourgeoisie who are, decadent, being part of the lumpen proletariat. So he was not looking at the term only in terms of the poor and the destitute. But if you have a growth strategy in which not only do you have labor reserves rising relative to the active army of labor, if you have a regime of primitive accumulation of capital, if you have a regime of bubbles, of Ponzi finance, of which we have seen the latest example in West Bengal, which, by the way, is also a form of primitive accumulation of capital, because lots of people's savings are simply being taken away by some, it's siphoned off. So you find that, therefore, this is a period in which there is a substantial increase in the relative weight of the lumpen proletariat compared to that of the proletariat proper. I believe that's a major hallmark of the kind of development that we are witnessing in India. Now, this, of course, has again a number of very important economic, social, and political consequences. I'd just like to discuss one particular political consequence, and that is to do with democracy. Now, anyway, globalization is something which has a fundamentally, or the pursuit of neoliberal policies which permits free flows of commodities and capital, has a fundamentally anti-democratic content. Because if democracy means anything, what it means is that the people should be able to choose between alternative agendas and therefore between alternative political formations pushing those different agendas. But if you have a situation where, because of neoliberal economic policies and therefore the possibility of financial outflows anytime, no matter which government comes to power, as long as it remains tied to the a regime of globalization, has to pursue policies to the liking of globalized finance capital, then you have a fundamental negation of democracy. People can vote alternative governments, but all of them end up pursuing the same policies, which is forced upon them by the fact that as long as they remain part of the globalized regime, they have to please finance capital. But this, of course, raises the danger that sometimes some government may come that wishes to de-link itself from the globalized regime. And this danger continues to haunt the corporate financial interests who are linked to globalized finance capital. True that this danger is something against which all kinds of safeguards in quotes exist. First is that even if you had such a government, the immediate outflow of finance can be so large that even before any capital controls have been put in, the country would have already been brought down to its knees. As a matter of fact, in the years when Nelson Mandela was coming to power in South Africa, there were such massive capital outflows that Nelson Mandela had to actually appoint Derek Keyes, who was the finance minister of the apartheid government, as the finance minister of the new government in order to retain what is called in quotes the confidence of the investors. So there is that safeguard. There is, of course, the fundamental class safeguard that as long as the corporate financial interests themselves, who control the media and so on, are wedded or are a part of the globalized finance, as long as the bubble sustained boom keeps sections of the urban middle classes happy, you have a substantial social support for it, where it is not even possible quite easily to have a regime that even wishes to de-link. But nonetheless, that danger remains, and it remains particularly in periods of crisis. And therefore, a tendency develops, as far as the corporate financial interests are concerned, of directly controlling the state. Not indirectly, indirect controls they have, but directly controlling the state. Indirect controls, as I said, they have because you have, after all key positions of decision making which have been given out to employees and ex-employees of the World Bank. You look at finance minister, you look at anywhere, they basically, all planning commission, prime minister secretary, they are the ones who actually control key levers of decision making. At the same time, when it comes to the traditional political class, which has been, as it were, made to relinquish these key levers of decision making, corruption plays a very important role in actually making them accept this new development. Professor Bagchi was talking about the colonial times. It's a bit like Robert Clive actually giving some money to the Mughal emperor in order to take away the Diwani of Bengal and so on. In other words, you have, as it were, a system that pays off the traditional politicians in order to take away from them the rights to key decision making, which are then entrusted to the employees and ex-employees of World Bank, IMF, and the so-called global financial community. Now, all those are there. Additionally, there are deeper social kind of problems in the way of such delinking. The link with communalism, which I believe Aja is talking about, is one very important kind of thing, which keeps people disunited, etc., etc. But nonetheless, there is a degree of uncertainty, and therefore globalized finance, with which our corporate financial interests are closely aligned, would like a direct control of the state. There is a further reason for it. The further reason is that the conquest of the economy by the corporate financial elite is not complete. True, there has been substantial liberalization, but don't forget, in India, there are still some checks. You still have a public sector in which the Navaratnas are still, as it were, despite substantial disinvestment, are still state-owned. You still have a banking system in which the bulk of the banks are still state controlled. Former governor of the Reserve Bank of India was once telling us that again and again from America, you have had Geithner, you have Summers, you have various people coming and saying that, look, just do one thing, privatize the State Bank of India. But State Bank of India still has not been privatized. You have a situation where autonomy of the central bank is still not achieved. You have a situation where, even though it appeared prior to 2008 that the system of procurement of crops and so on is progressively going to be abandoned, it has been refurbished, if you like, in the period of price rise after 2008. So you have a situation where the withdrawal of the state from a certain supporting role is not as complete as corporate financial interests would like to have it, and therefore their conquest of the economy is not as complete as they would like to have it. For that reason, again, they would like a direct control over the state. And I think moves towards such a direct control are obvious. Moves towards such a direct control are obvious, for instance, in the touting of a man who is now being openly projected as the darling of the corporate sector as the coming prime minister. Now, it's not as if they are unhappy with the current prime minister, but the point is it's an insurance policy, and at the same time they want to legitimize a situation in which a corporate nominee for prime ministership can be openly projected. I don't know if you have seen, the Times of India was running a poll recently. Should India Incorporated have a say in how tax revenues are going to be spent? Now, in a democracy, it's the people who have a say, but India Incorporated wishes to have an additional say over and above all this, which basically means a degree of direct control over the state. In 2004, when the NDA government lost, Wall Street Journal had an article in which it said, but this is absurd, you cannot have in a country like India, newly emerging economy, all stakeholders must have a say in who the new government is going to be. Why only the electorate? All stakeholders, including foreign capital, including India Incorporated, must have a say in who is going to be elected. So the idea of the direct control over the state by corporate financial interests for these reasons is something which is gaining ground. Now, direct control by the state over, by the corporate financial interests over the state is typically what we associate with fascism. Now, of course, we think of fascism always in terms of the 1930s. Since in 1930s, fascism basically meant, in Kaleski's terms, no next government So we think in terms of fascism as a form of governance in which there is no next government. But let's not forget that in the 1930s, you had a situation where finance capital was still nation-based. You had German finance capital, the Krupps and so on, who were backing the Nazis. Now you have a period of a situation of globalized finance capital in which there are already checks and balances against what the next government can do. In the 1930s, again, you had, as Omyoda said, a substantial threat of communist takeover. In Germany, the communist revolution had been defeated, but nonetheless, there was a very strong communist party. And what is more, if you look at the working class parties as a whole, social democratic as well as revolutionary, they actually commanded the majority of votes. And therefore, permitting a next government is something which was extremely dangerous, and therefore fascism took that kind of a form. In today's context, I see no reason why you cannot have kinds of experiment with fascism in which there may be elections, but as long as no matter who the election throws up as the next government, the corporate financial elite directly controls the state, and as long as the working class movement and the communists are ruthlessly suppressed, physically, coercively suppressed, then that can be a form of fascist experiment. Now, I think that kind of creeping fascism is already visible in India. And in my view, the relative increase in the weight of the lumpen proletariat as opposed to the proletariat is something which is very helpful to the corporate financial elite from this point of view. We don't have to go very far. In West Bengal, a political party which is basically recruited from the lumpen proletariat, as is clear from this latest scam in which virtually comprehensive involvement of that political party. Now, insofar as you can have that political party engaged in a real ruthless suppression of the communists. Now, this is something which, even if that party itself is not directly promoting any corporate financial agenda, that party is nonetheless helping the emergence of corporate financial control in a direct sense as far as the state is concerned. Now, I think the fact that this capitalist development throws up a situation in which the relative social weight of the lumpen proletariat is greater than of the proletariat, or could be greater, or is greater certainly than the proletariat compared to classical capitalism, is a matter which is of very serious concern as far as the preservation of democracy in this country is concerned. If one thinks in terms of the long period of colonial struggle as anti-colonial struggle as India's long revolution, then we are witnessing a counter-revolution today, which has many features. One feature, of course, is the rise in inequality, the rise in the size of the relative labor reserves, and so on, informal employment, casual, and all the rest of it, and its economic implications. The second feature in the realm of foreign policy, where you have much closer integration with US imperialism, talk in terms of a US, Israel, India axis. But certainly a third feature of this counter-revolution is a relative increase in the size of the lumpen proletariat compared to the proletariat, which, as I said, has very important political implications. Of course, it has very important social implications. Some of these we are seeing in the extremely increased incidence of gender oppression, which is now coming to light. Certainly there are many factors behind it, but in my view, the lumpenization of society that comes with this increased weight of the lumpen proletariat is certainly one factor, but I think the political consequences of it is something which especially those in the left have to be extremely conscious of. Thank you.
I request Professor Aizaz Ahmad to speak before us. He will be speaking on communalism's changing forms and fortunes since independence. Those who are interested in writing, giving questions, you please hand over all those questions to the volunteers so that he will give all of them to us.
Comrade Raghavelu, Professor Bagchi, comrades and friends. It's a very, very great honor for me to be participating in the seminar in honor of the late comrade Sundarayya. When I was first invited for the honor of delivering a lecture in his name a few years ago, I could hardly believe that I was worthy of it. I don't want to add anything to what Professor Bagchi and Professor Patnaik has already said about the late comrade Sundarayya. His presence is still among us, and he remains a great inspiration for all of us. I am very grateful for the lecture that Professor Patnaik gave a bit earlier, because that really sets up the structural basis for the argument that I'll be presenting to you. And my argument is, of course, very much more about the superstructure that rises on the basis of the analysis that he gave of the structural foundations of Indian political economy. Towards the end, he said several things, which in my own way I shall be more or less replicating. Now, most of us here know the basic facts. Some of you undoubtedly know many more facts than I do. And therefore, I will not try to assemble some kind of a factual narrative of this happened and then that happened and then that happened. Most of you know what that is. I'll try to my interest would be mainly in examining some of the terms in which we have ourselves thought of communalism, secularism, nationalism, etc., and in thinking of the changing forms in relation to enduring structures. Let me state at the very outset my fundamental position in the starkest terms. Communalism in all its forms is, in my view, not an epiphenomenal disease in an otherwise healthy body politic, or a sectional pathology while the nation in general remains secular, or an epidemic of morbid behavior owed to the machinations of RSS, Shiv Sena, etc., etc., that can be cured with larger and larger doses of secularism, nationalism, etc. I rather believe that the sum of beliefs and practices, which we call communal, have complex historic roots and are by now very deeply ingrained in the very structures of Indian society and our day-to-day politics. So deeply ingrained that much of it passes unnoticed. A critique of ideology is undoubtedly very important, and even more important perhaps is the accumulation of facts and figures regarding communal violence, which goes on ruining lives every day. But we need also to anchor such accounts and critiques in a much more fundamental structural analysis of the society from which communal ideas and practices arise, and in which millions of people find such ideas admirable and such practices not only legitimate but necessary and beneficial. Participation in communal politics in India is not a small-scale matter. Communalism in all its forms and practices strikes me as a useful index for gauging where the Republic has been going for some 65 years and where it now stands. Narendra Modi is, as of now, a symptom, and I dare say rather an appropriate symbol for where the nation has been headed for quite a while now, certainly for just over 2 decades, but possibly 4 decades, as we shall see. If he does become Prime Minister, which is a very big if, I'm not suggesting that he will, but if he does, we shall, of course, have crossed yet another milestone in this journey. The direction itself shall not be radically different, I believe, because the direction is now set. There is also another way of saying this. Rosa Luxemburg was right. Capitalism does not lead necessarily to socialism. It may just as well lead to barbarism. Let me add that Luxemburg's maxim is all the more applicable to the kind of predatory capitalism India has been embarked upon. The potentialities of barbarism in this kind of capitalism are all the greater. Because the various forms of communalism can benefit and indeed energize directly and indirectly not only the makers of this kind of capitalism, but also very great numbers among its victims, a point to which I shall return at the end of the paper. Clara Zetkin was more precise about her own time. Fascism, she said, is just punishment for our failure to make the revolution. I shall come later to what we call communal fascism. Let me just say that Zetkin's assertion helps us grasp two things about our own time. First, the global defeat of the left has given rise to very powerful forces of the extreme right in most parts of the world, with three sizable consequences. Marxism and communism now command very much narrower space today than they did before 1989. Neoliberalism, or extreme capitalism, as I call it, has registered impressive victories in large parts of the globe without any major counteroffensive from the working classes despite deep recessions in the capitalist core. And in diverse zones of Africa and Asia, nationalism itself has been emptied of anti-imperialist content, redefined in ethno-religious terms, and closely aligned with a global neoliberal regime. Narendra Modi is an iconic figure in this regard. He rose to prominence and regional power as an extremist practitioner of what we call communalism, and what he and his colleagues call Hindu nationalism. Now, as he seeks to capture leadership of his party and the nation as a whole, that identity is taken for granted but not reiterated. Instead, he represents himself as a richly dressed man of the golf course. There are these amazing photographs of Narendra Modi, glossy, wearing glossy clothes, holding these golf sticks, and one who routinely hobnobs with Ambanis, the Tatas, and literally hundreds of Indian origin CEOs drawn from all corners of the world, even as he receives apologetic emissaries from the US and the United Kingdom. A point that Prabhat made earlier. Indeed, he looks remarkably like President Morsi of Egypt, a veteran leader from the Muslim Brotherhood, even in his looks, actually. The same kind of beard, same kind of beard. The second point that arises from Zetkin's observation is that, as regards the internal politics of India, the success of various communalisms is, in the final analysis, an index of the failures of the left. Because, as I shall be arguing, the real alternative to communalism is communism, or if you like, socialism, not secularism or nationalism, however much these might help in the ideological domain. I shall return to that proposition. Let me first engage you with three words, which we use very often, and I want to be a bit precise about them because that is germane to my argument. Communalism. The first thing to be noted is that we use each of these words in a characteristically Indian way, giving them meanings that speakers of English elsewhere, or political thinkers and activists elsewhere for that matter, may not always grasp. Only in India does the word communalism refer to a malignant ideology and violence-prone practice, even a form of fascism, which justifies itself in the name of religious difference. Only in India do we have what we call communal riot. In Egypt, for instance, attacks on the Christian minority are straightforwardly called Islamist, jihadist, Salafist, or some such thing. All much stronger terms than communalism. On the other hand, in most inherited usages, the word communal has historically been a close cousin of the word communist, related as both words are to other words like common, commune, and community, in the sense of a community of interest, customs in common, etc. Communal property, for instance, was the historic opposite of private property. There are two further complications here. One is that we have no difficulty in talking about majority community and minority community, more specifically Hindu community, Muslim community, Sikh community, etc. But the people who, in our own view, actually belong to such communities are then required not to have a communal consciousness, but to act only as citizens of the Indian state. Religiously defined communal identity is thus affirmed, but privatized, debarred from politics, in the name of the secular moralism of the nation state. Considering that the very vast majority of the Indians enjoy no rights of citizenship except the abstract right of universal suffrage, it is all the more likely that, most people would feel much less moved by our nationalist discourses and would be more attached to what we ourselves regard as the communities of their actual religious belief, affective relationships, and social belongings. Nor is it clear to me how long a religiously defined community can remain so basic to one's own social and material life without one ever sliding into that bad side of that identity which we call communalism. I shall return to this point later. Now about the second word, secularism. I want to say right away that redefinition of secularism as equal respect for all religions is a peculiarly Indian invention. An attempt to pass off the traditional ethic of religious toleration as the modern virtue of secularism. For the actually believing person, there is always something unique about his own religion so that he cannot possibly have equal respect for a different religion. For a believing Muslim, Hinduism is intrinsically inferior. More to the point, equal rest. This is the real point. More to the point, equal respect for all religions in the conduct of the affairs of the state would necessarily lead, especially in the context of the corruptions of the liberal democratic politics, to greater respect for the religion of the demographic majority, whose votes count for most. In India, the demographic majority of those defined as Hindus by the state itself is so overwhelming that the state must necessarily favor Hindus in its secularism, regardless of which political party is in power. Between the Congress and the BJP, there would be necessarily a difference of degree, thanks mainly not to different ideologies so much as to the difference in the constituency blocks that they wish to address. On this issue, Perry Anderson seems to have a point. The Indian state, he says, is a Hindu communal state that uses secularism as its legitimating ideology. I would put it very differently, though, on 2 points. First, Mr. Anderson overlooks the decisive point that it has not always been so. The idea that the difference in the Hinduness of Gandhi and Nehru, or the Nehruvian state, on the one hand, and the RSS is only a matter of degree, is a preposterous idea. Second, I would say that the Indian state now, at this juncture, is in large measure a communal state that can accommodate all sorts of communalisms, including notably the Muslim one, but it is predominantly a Hindu communal state only because Hindu communalists are far more numerous and more powerful than all the other communalists combined. Or to put it differently, the Indian state can live with communalism perfectly happily so long as communal violence is minimized, because such violence, like any other violence in public affairs, creates a law and order problem. Secularity, in my view, is a modern virtue that arises out of no pre-modern traditions whatsoever, and which rests on a single requirement: radical separation between all forms of religion and all forms of state practice. That is to say, eviction of religion from the domain of politics as such. In its origins, this is a European virtue. However, before we get too nationalistic in such matters, it is best to recall that Marxism is also, in its origins, a European virtue. The main thing is that about such virtues is that they originate in one place in accordance with historical necessities, but then gradually universalize themselves also in accordance with historical conditions. If the Indian bourgeoisie turns out to be too unmodern in its own social outlook to insist on real separation of religion from the actual conduct and legitimating processes of its own state, this modern virtue will degenerate into a slogan and will get redefined in religious terms. Sarv Dharm Sambhav. Let me add that secularism in this basic sense has always been not an achieved fact, but something of a horizon for definition of aspirations. Capitalist states have typically acted with liberal duplicity, professing high principle but acting otherwise in accordance with pragmatic convenience. Most of Europe is currently undergoing enormous cultural upheavals because of its incapacity to accommodate non-European immigrants of a different race of religion. It is very doubtful that the United States of today is more secular than the India of today. And the US just happens to have an older, more entrenched history of public inhibition and more institutional constraint. The two capitalist states that truly attempted proper secularism in their best days, when their bourgeoisie was youthful, were revolutionary France and Kemalist Turkey. Neither can claim that distinction today. The only states that really attempted secular separation of church and state, and to ensure that the church had no authority outside strictly private life, were the communist countries. A fact that can be witnessed in the extremely violent backlash national and international religious authorities before and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the unremitting bases of warfare against the communist systems was the religious one. And the very idea of a total separation between church and state was absolutely unacceptable to the Western bourgeoisie. So it's not a European virtue in that sense. The idea happens to be European in origin, that's all. Finally, the most difficult of the three words, nationalism. With the exception of the Russian Revolution, all other socialist revolutions, including in China and Cuba, were made in colonial and semi-colonial countries. Movements for socialism were therefore combined with wars of national liberation. Meanwhile, the more progressive of the bourgeois states in the Third World have periodically adopted relatively nationalistic economic policies, as was the case with Nehruvian India, Nasserist Egypt, and Ba'athist Arab states in the heyday of the Bandung Project, and is currently the case in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. These histories have led to a tendency in contemporary theorizing to identify nationalism straightforwardly with anti-imperialism. This is further complicated by the fact that in the colonizing countries, nationalist ideology arose in opposition to colonialism, and this anti-colonialism is often misconstrued as an anti-imperialism. Even though a majority of such nationalisms had no socialist content whatever and were glad to get assimilated quite quickly into the neo-colonial socialist content, into the new neo-colonial designs of imperial capital. Africa is replete with histories of such anti-colonial nationalism, not to speak of Pakistan or Bangladesh and our two main neighbors, whose nationalisms have never been associated very much with anti-imperialism. And there are other, even more complicated cases, such as that of the Taliban, who are certainly fighting against a savage war of imperialist occupation, but can hardly be identified as a socially progressive force for their people. Elsewhere, virtually all the serious scholarship of European fascist movements of the 20th century is agreed that one of the key founding moments for the rise of such ideologies is to be found in the French movement of the late 19th century, which called itself integral nationalism. The roots of European fascism are in nationalist ideology, and so on. Now, my own view is that nationalism per se has no class content, nor a well-defined political content. This content is given to any nationalism by the power bloc that takes hold of it and incorporates it in its own class project. Nationalist ideology is objectively connected with the nation-state form. So long as the nation-state form exists, nationalism of one kind or another is an objective necessity. There can be a fascist nationalism of Nazi Germany, imperialist nationalism of the United States, revolutionary nationalism of Ho Chi Minh, secular Arab nationalism, clerical nationalism of Iran, etc., etc. There will always be nationalism, and there will always be contest over the meaning of nationalism in any society. And what we are witnessing actually is a great bloody contest over the meaning of nationalism, over the meaning of Indian nationalism. And one kind of nationalism can be defeated and replaced by another kind of nationalism in the life of the same nation state. These days it has become very fashionable with devastating effects in many parts of the world for vast numbers of people to declare that a particular religion is the defining characteristic of a particular nation. Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Catholicism, Buddhism, every religion has come to be used to justify one national chauvinism or the other. It's a global phenomenon. If that claim is made in India, it is part of a global structure which has arisen with the crisis of the left, which sets in my view, in the late 70s and reaches its critical moment in 1989. I say all this for a reason. In my view, you have to be already a leftist to believe that only anti-imperialism can be the true content of Indian nationalism. I believe it because I'm a Marxist. Unfortunately, Marxism is very much a minority position in this country. An influential position, but still a minority position. I see no reason why an urban, upper caste, middle class, socially conservative Hindu would not be spontaneously oriented towards accepting the Hindutva proposition that what is unique about India, and therefore its defining feature among nations, is that the great majority of its citizens are Hindu. And Hindu culture must therefore be accepted as national culture. Those who do not accept this culture as the normative culture of India are really not Indian in the real sense. I have said this about upper caste, middle class, etc., to make a point. Given the strength of right-wing domination in India, not necessarily communal, just right-wing domination, I see no reason why a majority of the kinds of people who are interested in the question at all would not find at least some version of this identification between Hinduness and India quite plausible and even necessary for country to remain united and strong. And this belief can go together with the idea of religious tolerance, with the idea of Sarvdharma Sambhav, the belief that Hindus are tolerant, liberal, peace-loving by nature, and the national disunity comes from others who are much too narrow-minded, fundamentalist, socially backward, etc. So when we ask ourselves whether or not communalism could ever become not just a majoritarian ideology, but in fact something of a common sense for millions upon millions of people, the answer would probably depend on which version of communalism we have in mind. That was not always so. And the sea change needs to be seen in terms of a radical rearrangement of hegemonies. Something I think that Prabhat was talking about. Let me recall a simple fact. Since its inception in 1925 until today, over 80 years or more, the RSS has a very, very impressive record of incremental growth in its direct membership, year by year. Over 80 years, every year. A classic case of what Gramsci might have called a war of position and an incipient passive revolution. All this, but with one exception. Its membership did not grow, remained stagnant between 1948 and 1962. These are the years immediately following Gandhi's assassination and the height of the Nehruvian project. 1962 is a significant date because it is the year of India-China War. The first time in independent India when anti-communism became a fashionable position in the urban middle classes. Got tied with national chauvinism in that way. And no wonder that the membership of the RSS started growing after 1962. Now, it is often said that this stagnation for about 14-15 years was caused by broadly held belief that RSS was involved in Gandhi's assassination, and people therefore turned against the RSS. That probably is a factor. However, the central fact, in my view, was the kind of overall hegemony that prevailed at the time. There was, of course, the enormous political and cultural capital at the command of the government led by Nehru, with all the legitimacy bestowed upon it by having led the anti-colonial movement. But it is also important to recall that the main opposition to him within Parliament itself came from communists and socialists. So that one could say that the whole of Indian politics, the state itself as the condensation of political society, was dominated by forces opposed to communalism. However powerful the communist currents in much of society might have been. As his voluminous correspondence with chief ministers would testify, Nehru was acutely aware of the communalism rampant within the Congress itself. Yet, four things about the moment of left hegemony need to be said. One, this was the only time in the history of the Republic that those who dominated the state in governance and in opposition sought to combat communalism frontally, the machinations of the Congress right notwithstanding. Second, while the bourgeoisie was greatly pampered through protectionism and the public sector serving the private sector, it was nevertheless virtually the only time that any attempt was made to curb the inordinate greed of this class. Third, this was the only time the Indian state sought to consistently perform a progressive pedagogical function. This is very important because from Hegel to Marx to Gramsci, all left-wing political theory has spoken of the state as a pedagogical function, whether for the right or for the left. It's a massively pedagogical function. The state teaches the society to be what it should be. This was the only time the Indian state sought to consistently perform a progressive pedagogical function, trying to inculcate modern, secular, progressive values into the anachronistic social order at large. This can certainly be seen in the new textbooks of the period, but also, far more importantly, in incessant political speech addressed by leaders of government and opposition alike to the masses of people who were already highly politicized by the anti-colonial movement. Finally, secularism was not seen as an isolated value in itself, but as part of a set of values and lines of collective action. Universal suffrage for a society almost 90% illiterate, non-alignment as an assertion of national independence in the domain of foreign relations, protection of the productive economy against imperialist encroachment, leading role of a somewhat reform-minded state, and socialistic development in economic affairs, and so on. There was more promise than performance, but the promise itself served a political function. That the main opposition came from the left of the Nehruvian state, not from the right that was effectively contained, was central in the construction of popular consent for the totality of a social vision in which secularist values were embedded. I think communists have played an enormously civilizing role in this country over the past 65 years. As the one oppositional, rational, secular force in the country. It is deeply civilizing influence. Now that all the rest has been abandoned by the entire spectrum of political actors in the country, with the single exception of the left, it is difficult to see what there is in the neoliberal right-wing configuration where secular value can be materially embedded. What we have witnessed in many parts of the world, from the US and the enlarged EU to many of the Muslim majority countries is that wherever this neoliberal consensus triumphs, right-wing triumphalism necessarily leads to the eclipse of ecumenical secular reason. Can India be an exception? What has been the main milestone in this churning of hegemonies? I have published 3 essays where this issue has come up. I'll skip precise reference. Since then, over the past decade, there has been no significant shift in this regard. In a more recent essay, where the issue of Indian postmodernism comes up, I have suggested that post-independence history can be broadly conceptualized in terms of 3 phases. The first lasts from 1947 to 1975, roughly speaking, from the inception of the Nehruvian paradigm to its final crisis and dissolution in the emergency. A second phase lasting roughly the next 2 decades begins with the massive ambiguities of the JP movement and the post-emergency Janta government, which served the function of legitimizing the RSS as a respectable force in Indian politics and giving its political front a significant place in government. In fact, both Vajpayee and Advani emerged as holders of major ministries in that government for the first time. A matter, something inconceivable 5 to 7 years before that. On the whole, this is a phase of relative political crisis of the bourgeois state in India, when the old power bloc is no longer capable of stable rule, but none other has emerged to replace it either. This phase of crisis ends with the advent of the second Vajpayee government in 1998, even though the decisive turning points had come earlier, nationally and internationally, during those momentous 3 years from 1989 to 1992. Internationally, these years witnessed the historic demise of the communist system in the Soviet Union and Southeastern Europe, and the consequent rise of the US as a global hegemon with no rival. The whole of the Indian ruling class and its state structure could now openly unite behind this new imperialist power with no internal friction at all. Inside the country, those years witnessed the onset of the neoliberal regime with the so-called Rao-Manmohan reforms and their decisive turn in institutionalizing communalism in structures of the Indian state, which began with the tacit agreement between the Congress and the VHP at the time of the Shilanyas in 1989, and even more dramatically during the destruction of the Babri Masjid. This phase of crisis ends in 1998, when a new and stable power bloc of the Indian right arises with a BJP-led government. At the heart of this new consensus is the Indian ruling class. Consensus in the Indian ruling class is close alliance with imperialism externally and the imposition of neoliberal order domestically. This neoliberal order is what I call extreme capitalism. The Congress serves as the formally secular face of this class consensus, while BJP serves as its communal face, even though it is quite willing to keep the more provocative aspects of its program in suspension so that it may remain at the apex of power in a broad coalition. Significantly, Modi is now basing his prime ministerial bid not on the Hindutva plank, but exactly on that rhetoric of growth that has served Manmohan Singh so well. As for the communal issue, the main point is in the political domain is that there is no significant political party in the country, with the exception of the left, that has not colluded with the BJP at one point or another. Increasing communalization of popular consciousness can now proceed from 2 sides. There is, of course, that mass work by the RSS and its affiliates, which has gained more and more adherents over some 80 years in what Gramsci called the quotidian molecular movements in the very quality of mass perceptions at the very base of society. But now, for many years, those same shifts can come from the side of the state as well. Its political parties, educational enterprises, repressive apparatuses, often even the judicial branch. As India increasingly becomes a national security state, the bases for an aggressive, masculinist, right-wing, fascistic nationalism are bound to go deeper into society at large. Let me add that our analyses of communalism tend to concentrate on the Sangh Parivar because it is the largest, best organized communal force in the country. This much what I have read so far, you have. Now I'm going to read what I wrote this morning. Let me add that our analyses of communalism tend to concentrate on the Sangh Parivar because it is the largest, best organized communal force in the country. But I should like to briefly consider two other cases as well, of Muslim communalism and of Shiv Sena, respectively. Muslims in their generality have always sought a secular electoral alternative, not because they are particularly secular in their outlook, but because they expect greater security for themselves in a secular dispensation. Secularism for them is thus not an ideological outlook or a political position, but an expedient community interest. For the rest, Muslim communal leaders, clerical religious zealots, socially conservative forces more generally command immense power among them. Communalization of the state agencies on the ground, as well as the periodic outright violence against them, serves to strengthen the hold of those forces within the Muslim population. The use of state terror in Kashmir, not only against jihadi terror, but also against popular protests and uprisings, further accentuates their sense of alienation from the Indian state and comes on top of their sense of social, economic, educational, and professional deprivation more generally. Since Babri Masjid and then especially after Gujarat, there is now a growing fringe. And it's a fringe, very much a fringe. A growing fringe among urban Muslim youth that dreams of organizing Muslim jihadi terror against Hindu communal terror, which gains much inspiration from the rise of sundry jihadi groupings across a number of Muslim majority states, notably in Pakistan next door. A notable feature of this vortex is that there are visible secular currents among Muslims. Of this vortex is that although there are visible and large secular currents among Muslims, there persists a remarkable lack of political organization among these currents. And Muslims, qua Muslims, rarely get organized on progressive platforms. More recently, for instance, we have witnessed impressive demonstrations by cross sections of Indian Muslims in support of the Bangladesh Muslim League, but none in favor of the Shahbag agitations. In the upper layers of Muslim communalism, if the upper layers of Muslim communalism often takes an oppositional stance in order eventually to gain a chauvinist relationship with a clientelist relationship with the state, the lower levels of these Muslim communal forces display the same lumpenization that is characteristic of Shiv Sena or the mass organizations of the Sangh Parivar, even though they are much less prone to go on rampages of violence, because they expect greater hostility from the police and other security agencies, not the kind of support that these very agencies give to their Hindu counterparts. This feature of widespread lumpenization brings me then briefly to Shiv Sena, which always reminds me of Mussolini's description of fascists as super relativists. He said, "We fascists are super relativists." The other quotation of Mussolini that came to my mind was when, when Prabhat was speaking. When he defined fascism very simply, he says fascism is a system in which the state and corporations become one. Exactly what Prabhat was saying about this Modi's candidacy being the candidacy of corporate takeover. All right. I don't have the time for a full-scale analysis of the Sena, but a couple of key points can be offered very briefly. One is that the only consistent element in Thackeray's ideology has been his great hatred of communists and of the left more generally. For the rest, the cynical pursuit of power that the RSS camouflages through all the talk of Hindu culture, tradition, and nationalism comes out naked in the case of the Sena. Founded in 1966, it came fully into the Hindutva ideological matrix only in the 1980s. Well after the Jansangh had made great strides through prominent participation in the Janata government. At one point, Thackeray had even supported the emergency. Political pragmatism in this sense has been extreme. The case of Shiv Sena also illustrates how well a communalism can move back between religious forms of Hindutva and the subnational ethno-regional posture of Maharashtrian exclusivity. It not only made its extreme fortunes in the anti-Tamil rampages well before turning to Hindutva, it was also perfectly capable of turning its lumpen mass base against North Indians, Biharis in particular, irrespective of their religious affiliations, just as outsiders whose presence in Bombay was said to be producing Maharashtrian deprivation. And all this at the time when it is seen as a full-fledged Hindutva force. Moreover, the strong arm lumpenized violence successively against Tamils, Muslim, Biharis, Bengalis, who are stigmatized as Bangladeshis. Individual members of the mobs that are organized by the perpetrators of this violence, for the perpetration of this violence, gain directly through looting, shakedowns, etc., and much wealth is thus transferred to the coffers of the party. So that communalism itself emerges as an organized crime, which in the context of Bombay often gets connected with other forms of organized crime. This is, of course, a punctual feature of the politics of communal riots in general. Shiv Sena is just more blatant and enjoys greater support from the lower middle classes and urban poor and the lumpenized masses. Now, I'll not try to offer any formal conclusion. Let me just summarize 2 points. One, at every level, from the fundamental restructuring of the state to a sea change in ideological positions, to the creation of this new neoliberal alliance of the whole of the Indian ruling class, neoliberalism and communalism are seen as two faces of the same coin. The power of communalism in this country at every level has been tied up with this restructuring of India at all the levels, the state formation, ideological formation, the political economy of the country, and so on. And in the creation of a new Indian ruling class, and if this is going to be the dispensation that you have to turn your back on the national movement that led to the anti-colonial movement, which was secular and multi-denominational. If you turn back your back on that nationalism, then what do you do with the ideology of the nation state? You have to redefine your nationalism. Redefinition of nationalism in these religious, majoritarian, fascistic terms, arises objectively out of that project of redefining Indian society as a whole. The other point that I want to make, which I think for the left is extremely important, is that it is not only the beneficiaries of this extreme capitalism who benefit from secularism or who become a part of it. The social disorientation caused by this kind of capitalism is so great that all kinds of pathologies become rampant in society, and the victims themselves have to find some other kinds of identification, some other means of so immense number of the victims become the mass base of these high Brahminical, fascistic, upper class movements. You know, those lumpen masses of Bombay, who are the mass base of the Shiv Sena, are drawn from the poor, the lumpen proletariat, the lumpenized petty bourgeoisie. The importance of the lumpen proletariat that Prabhat was talking about. The same can be said for the mass base of the armies of destruction at the command of the RSS, Bajrang Dal and so forth, the car sevaks, etc. What class do they come from? So, it is the totality of the class structure that gets disoriented, and for the left, that is one of the great challenges in this. That when the victimized lumpen proletariat, even sections of the proletariat, get infected with this virus, creates a very different kind of atmosphere. And that is what I meant when I said that the real alternative to communism is to communalism is communism. It is that particular kind of capitalism that has to be challenged and destroyed if we are going to recreate India into a non-communal secular society. Thank you very much.